Almost all economists agree Europe is heading for a recession after all. Europe is seemingly dealing with a perfect economic storm. The storm consists of four elements: sky-high energy prices, a surging US dollar, a major slowdown in China, and finally the real possibility of a second Eurozone crisis. Therefore, the question that most economists are now asking is not, will there be a recession in Europe, but rather how bad will it be now? I've gone through a lot of their predictions and summarized them in the following three scenarios. The first scenario is a serious recession. The second scenario is an apocalyptic recession. And finally, the third scenario is a mild recession. Now I'll tell you which of these scenarios will definitely become a reality. So instead, I prefer to talk about scenarios of what might happen, how they might happen, and how likely it is that each scenario will happen. Based on my research, I think that the serious recession scenario is sadly the most likely. I would currently assign it a probability of 45%. Then I designed the apocalyptic Euro crisis scenario with a 15% probability. But there's hope. I think the short, mild recession scenario has a 35% probability. Next, let me tell you how I got to these probabilities and what each scenario might look like, because if you know how I got to these numbers, you can adjust them up or down as you see fit. For example, if you disagree with my assumptions, or you can update the probabilities yourself as new events unfold. For example, if Dutch politicians starts pressuring them to stop buying it in debt, you can then increase the probability of the apocalyptic Euro crisis scenario. Okay, with all of that out of the way, let's start with the scenario that I think is most likely. In the serious recession scenario, Europe's GDP will soon start contracting. What's worth, this contraction will be so large that a yearly economic growth will soon be negative. But how bad will it be exactly? Well, in this scenario, and in line with predictions from economists at Deutsche Bank, Europe's GDP would drop by 1.5 to 3%. Now, the problem with throwing GDP numbers around like that, in my experience, is that they don't mean much to most people. Sure, we know that GDP measures total spending in the economy. So a GDP drop means that people spend less on average, but the consequence of reduced spending are typically not felt by most people who have a steady job. Instead, it is typically felt by business owners, especially those in industries that are considered luxuries in tough times. But you should also be worried if you are a worker without a permanent contract. And finally, if you're an investor, it would be good to make sure that markets have already priced in this scenario. But in any of these cases, you should ask yourself the question, should you believe in this scenario? Well, that depends on developments in the four elements of Europe's perfect economic storm. The energy market would appear to be the most logical place to look first. Now, if you are not in Europe, or you have a fixed price energy contract, it is quite likely that you are underestimating how bad Europe's energy crisis already is. You see, the price of gas used by most Europeans for heating purposes went from 15 megawatts per hour to 343 euros per megawatt hour over the summer. And while these prices have now come down to roughly 200 euros, this is still more than a 10 times increase compared to last year. Once more, electricity prices have risen by up to 600% in some countries, compared to last year. As a consequence, the poorest households in countries like the Netherlands, UK and Estonia have already seen their cost of living increase by 10 to 25%. And so far they have compensated by drawing down what limited savings they had. But even if prices stabilized, they will soon have to rein in their spending. And given that spending is literally how we define our economy, this is hurting the economy directly now for European businesses. The picture is just as bleak so far. Just like households, they were able to absorb higher energy costs. However, if energy prices remain this high, they will have to rein in their investment spending as well, once again directly hurting the economy. The key part of our serious recession scenario is that energy prices will roughly remain at the current law. This could either be because of a particularly cold winter or because Russia reduces the gas flow even further now. So far the blow has been cushioned somewhat by European governments. However, in this scenario, most European governments now choose to only help the poor and crucial industries either because they fear increasing government debt too much or they want to keep energy prices high to stimulate less energy. Alright, we're talking about Europe's upcoming recession. Energy prices are the obvious first candidate. However, I think that this serious recession scenario is most likely to be triggered by the rising dollar and the accommodating rising interest rates. After all, rising energy prices had a big impact on inflation in Europe. Almost all of its inflation is simply a reflection of 40% higher consumer energy prices, to a lesser extent higher energy prices to inflation in the US as well. And in response to this, your own power from the U.S. Federal Reserve is now raising interest rates rapidly, strangely enough. This is a particularly big problem for Europe. You see, if the U.S. raises interest rates faster than Europe, investors will find it attractive to sell a low straight yielding euros or pounds and buy higher interest rate yielding dollars. This means that the value of the European currencies will fall, and this in turn means that imports become quite a bit more expensive, increasing energy prices further as well as pushing up general inflation via these imports. To prevent that, the Bank of England and the ECB will have to follow the Federal Reserve to a certain extent and raise their interest rates. This will likely hurt their economies because it makes borrowing less attractive, and as we briefly saw in the UK, the financial system just doesn't seem to be able to handle much at the moment. Once more, household levels of debt are at all-time highs in Europe. And given that in many European countries, mortgage rates are quite flexible, increasing interest rates might get households and businesses into trouble rather quickly. In a serious recession scenario, power will keep raising interest rates up to a rate of 4.25 or 4.5% until December. Then, to prevent a collapsing pound or euro, the Bank of England will have to follow. And with interest rates rising higher than 3% per year, the European economies will slow even more. That's pretty bad. And this scenario gets a bit worse still. Now, so far, we have talked about European households and local firms, but what if I told you that Europe's strong export sector is now also at risk? The main reason is that the global economy is now projected to slow down considerably thanks to rising interest rates and high energy prices. The global economy is connected, and this means fewer companies for Europe's exporters now. Finally, and this is a big one, there's China. China is currently experiencing a big economic slowdown on the back of a collapsing housing market. And China just so happens to be Europe's second biggest export market, given that the UK is part of Europe. That is, now importantly, China's government could rescue its economy, saving this important export market for Europe. However, in the serious recession scenario, China either is not able or chooses not to prevent a recession. Okay, time for some good news then, I guess, because in the serious recession scenario, while countries like Italy and Greece once again get into a lot of trouble, the European Central Bank rescues them. This prevents a recession from getting out of hand to the same extent that it did in 2011. But now you might wonder, Yuri, is that realistic? Will they actually save Southern Europe? Well, I think there's a good chance. But in the small chance that they don't, then Europe ends up in its apocalyptic scenario. Now, let's talk about something that I tried to stay away from for a long time, and that is an apocalyptic scenario. The reason for me staying away from that is exactly this situation. That is, if something like that is a serious option. If you talk about it all the time, nobody will take you seriously anymore. So with that being said, The apocalyptic scenario pretty much looks like the serious recession scenario at first. However, in this scenario, a serious recession spills over into a second Eurozone crisis. The Eurozone accounts for most of Europe's economic activity and its common currency. The euro is a bit different from that of other major economies you see. Unlike in China and the United States, the Eurozone does not have a central government, instead it has lots of governments and a single central bank. The Chinese government cannot run out of yuan given that it issues them itself. However, individual European governments such as Italy and Greece can run out of euros if the ECB decides that it will stop buying their debt. This is essentially what happened in Greece in 2011, and this caused the first Eurozone crisis. It was only until then PCB chief Mario Draghi said, "Whatever it takes," that the crisis disappeared. But now, if, say at least, new government needs PCB saving after spending too much, that politicians might say that this is indirectly paid for by them, since they partially own the European Central Bank, and thus they might pressure the ECB to stop supporting Italy. If that happens, Italy's government can no longer pay its bills and its economy will collapse. At that point, Italy might decide to leave the euro, and this dynamic might spread to countries like Greece, and this could still potentially end the euro hitting its economy with a shock that has never been experienced before. This small risk is why Italy has been in the news some, and this is Europe's apocalyptic scenario. However, even though it is possible, I personally don't expect it to happen because a euro crisis neither in Italy's nor in Europe's interest. Therefore, I would give this scenario a 15% probability. Okay, let's talk about the best scenario next, the mild recession scenario. Okay, so this is my optimistic scenario, and if it makes you feel better, this scenario is in line with what economists at prestigious institutions such as the IMF and OECD are currently predicting will likely happen. Sure, in this scenario, Europe's economy might shrink in some parts of 2022-2023. However, overall its economy will still grow slowly. How slowly? Well, GDP growth is predicted to slow from 2 to 3% this year, 20 to 1% next year. So how might this optimistic scenario come about when it comes to the energy crisis? There are two reasons to be optimistic. The first has to do with Russian supply. At the start of the war, Europe had few options to replace Russian imports. However, I don't think that people appreciate enough that Europe has all been able to roughly double its liquefied natural gas imports. This is partially thanks to increased usage of floating terminals such as this, a new one in the Netherlands better. 18 more of these are planned all over Europe. The second reason is all about demand. Energy analysts Pierre and around estimates that Europeans can do without Russian gas with a few behavioral changes, most notably by reducing average indoor temperatures from 22 degrees to 90 degrees Celsius. And I speak from experience when I say that if prices stay high, that is quite possible. I mean, since my energy bill tripled here in Belgium, I cut back on a lot of my energy and gas usage by setting the temperature in my house to 18 degrees. What's more, I had solar panels installed, cut wood during my summer holiday, had the fireplace cleaned and started using electrical appliances mostly during peak sun hours. And I know that many Europeans have taken similar measures. Was more in case of mild weather, Europe's guest amount could be cut by roughly 6% in the coming winter. But are there also reasons to be optimistic about rising interest rates in the US? Well, I think so. You see, energy costs and interest rates are interacting in a way that's possibly positive for Europe's economy. For example, if energy costs go down, then inflation will go down and interest rates don't need to go up this much, or might even come down as well. On the other hand, if interest rates continue to go up, then demand will slow down in the economy. And this means also less demand for energy, and hence energy prices are likely to come down. Then what's more, several indicators such as industrial production in Europe are falling rapidly, and so central banks might even reverse some of the rate hikes or signal clearly that no more rate hikes are coming in the future. And even if that doesn't pan out, raising rates does have some benefits as well for Europe. Sure, this will likely slow down the global economy, which is bad for Europe's exporters, but it also has an upside for inflation. After a global slowdown means reduced global demand, and reduced demand means reduced global inflation. This in turn lowers the likelihood of more rate hikes. Alternatively, China has already started stimulating its economy rather heavily, and it might stop locking down its economy in the near future. Therefore, it might continue to grow and demand more exports from Europe. Finally, the chance of a new euro crisis is much lower in this relatively optimistic scenario. The economy that most risks sparking the next euro crisis, Italy, is stronger than men. I think with a robust trade surplus in 2020 and 2021 was more. Its right-wing politicians might talk a big game, but before getting elected, they muted their tone considerably when it comes to the euro. Finally, the SP recently introduced a new policy instrument that allows them to support specific governments such as those in southern Europe, and it didn't even have to use it for Italy so far. But still, Europe's economic future is clearly gloomy and uncertain. And in this video I've sketched a mild series and apocalyptic recession scenario. I also gave them a rough probability, and finally, I sketched the main factors to look out for: energy, the dollar, China, and signs of a euro crisis. This will hopefully help you make up your own mind about how bad Europe's upcoming recession will be. However, as you might have noted, that the probabilities of my scenarios do not add up 200%, and hopefully you've also noticed how many interactions there are possible between these factors, and thus understand that it makes sense to assign a 5% probability to unforeseen scenarios, such as a global financial crisis, Norwegian pipelines suddenly exploding, or possibly even no recession. But yeah, what do you think? How likely do you think that each of these scenarios are? Let me know in the comments, or discuss it more in depth with Money.